It's the final week of the year, which means that we're finally getting those last two Game Boy Advance games the Nintendo promised for 2023, right? Sadly, that is not the case. It looks like F-Zero, Maximum Velocity, and Golden Sun will just have to wait for another month. The good news is that we still have a handful of Super NES games on the Nintendo Switch Online service that are in desperate need of the review crew treatment, including sports classics like Super Soccer, Super Tennis, and Natsume Championship Wrestling. Sure, these games hit the subscription service years ago, but I still need to ask, are any of these games actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of GamePro, Next Generation, Nintendo Power, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. So go and grab a jock strap and maybe a ball or something, because it's time for a very sporty episode of the Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew.
Super Formation サッカー2 4人のプレイも可能だよ Super Formation サッカー2やんなにやんな 3D Super Formation サッカー2好評発売中この夏登場ヒューマンベースボール
Nintendo is no stranger to sports games, but some younger players may be surprised to learn that not all of them star Mario and Luigi. For a while, in the 16-bit generation, they actually dabbled with licensed sports games, including Ken Griffey Jr. Baseball and NCAA Basketball. Sometimes they didn't even need a license to sell the game, which brings us to Super Soccer, one of only 2 soccer games on the Nintendo Switch Online service. This one comes with a surprising amount of history, as it's part of the long-running Formation Soccer franchise, which was created by Human Entertainment and bounced from the TurboGrafx-16 to the Super NES to the PlayStation. This 1992 Super NES game is the only one that was published by Nintendo, with most of the sequels not finding much play outside of Japan. This is a straightforward soccer simulation made in the early days of the Super NES. Which is something that may or may not appeal to you. Let's see if it appealed to the critics in 1992. Now we're going to start with GamePro, who ended up having a great time with Super Soccer and giving it a score of 4 out of 5. Although Super Soccer is somewhat limited in options, it does offer enough solid graphics and smooth gameplay to make it a contender for any World Cup. If you prefer to play soccer on the field instead of from a Skycam, then set your heading to the center circle of Nintendo Super Soccer and kick off a sporting spectacular. GamePro's score is more or less in line with Nintendo Magazine System, which gave the game a score of 79%. Nintendo Power more or less agreed with this verdict, going slightly lower with an average of 3.8 out of 5. This is the same score that we saw from Mean Machines, with Rad arguing that Super Soccer defies the laws of tradition in its presentation. The viewpoint is quite original, and this coupled with the fine graphics makes Super Soccer right tasty visually. Sadly, this isn't true for the gameplay. For starters, when you're playing downfield, hardly any of the forward players are displayed on screen, which makes passing a little difficult, especially as there's no radar. Secondly, Super Soccer is lacking in realism. Most of the time, it seems like the ball is one of those plastic 99-pence ones, such are its flyaway qualities. In an average match, the ball may only touch the ground 3 or 4 times, the rest of the while it's suspended in a state of one volley after another. All in all, Super Soccer is a potentially fantastic release spoilt by careless playtesting and minor design faults. Look, as one of only 2 soccer games on the Nintendo Switch Online, your options are a little limited here. My guess is that most soccer fans have already made up their decision, so let's go ahead and move on. If there's one thing that the Nintendo Switch Online service can teach us, is that you don't need a license to create a good sports game. That goes for wrestling, too. While other games slapped the WWF and WCW logos all over their boxes, Natsume Championship Wrestling managed to win over fans with its solid gameplay, generous modes, unique wrestlers, and most importantly, 4-player support. Released in 1994, this is a wrestling game that learned some valuable lessons from the influx of fighting games that had flooded the market, especially when it comes to the amount of different moves that each wrestler can pull off. The result is a well-regarded wrestling game that actually holds up a lot better than most of its licensed competition. Now, that is not necessarily how the critics saw it back in 1994. This is one of those games where he either really liked it or he just couldn't stand it. GamePro was on the hating it side, giving it a 2.5 out of 5, which is actually one of the magazine's lowest scores. If you think you've seen all that wrestling games have to offer, think again. This group of washed-out, overweight superstars shouldn't even be wrestling. They should be doing time. Natsume Championship Wrestling looks and plays like an 8-bit pretender. The undersized sprites and the run-of-the-mill moves are just as unsatisfying as the bad music and poor sound effects. Maybe this is what it's really like when you go to a wrestling match. Over at Nintendo Power, the magazine barely even reviewed the game. They gave it a very short paragraph description followed by only 4 pros and cons. They liked the good graphics and credited the game for having lots of moves, but hated that it didn't have real wrestlers and were frustrated by the complex play control. They gave Natsume Championship Wrestling a middling 2.7 out of 5. Now, it's not all bad news, as game players actually liked this wrestling game substantially more than their peers, giving the game an impressive 84%. Sure, they agreed that the overall graphics are average with small characters, and that there's very little variety with one ugly ring and largely identical characters. However, they like that there are lots of ways to play, from round robin to tag team. They explain that the wrestlers respond smoothly and the button combos are well laid out. And they even praised the varied attacks that let you experiment with neat combos and other strategies. It's got flaws, but the action on the map more than makes up for them. This is another great example of a genre being underrepresented on the Nintendo Switch Online service. Natsume Championship Wrestling may scratch that itch, but it's sort of a love it or hate it kind of thing.
王道を行く全日本プロレスがついにスーパーファミコンに強豪16選手が繰り広げるスーパーバトル超リアルプロレスゲーム全日本プロレス新発売メサイア
Here we have yet another straightforward sports simulator published by Nintendo. It's Super Tennis, an early Super NES sports game with 20 unlicensed players and a handful of modes. Okay, so maybe it's not as flashy as later tennis games, but what it lacks in pizzazz it more than makes up for with great gameplay. This is an early example of a tennis game done right, and Super Tennis excels as both a lengthy single-player game and a competitive multiplayer game. If you're looking for fun tennis action and you don't care about real players, then you might actually be surprised at how well this game holds up. Let's see if the critics agreed back in 1991. Unlike those other sports games on the Nintendo Switch Online service, there's no debate when it comes to this game. The critics loved Super Tennis. You saw rave reviews across the board, with more than a few magazines giving it near perfect marks. Because of this, I would normally start with the lowest score, which just so happens to be a 3.9 out of 5 from Nintendo Power. Frustratingly, this comes from an era when the magazine didn't even back up their scores with actual reviews, so we'll never really know what drove the score down. Instead, what we're going to do is look at the second worst review, which comes from Super Gaming's third issue, where they gave it an average score of 8 out of 10. Mike loved the game, giving it a 9 and calling it very cool. Now here's a game that I could really sit back and enjoy for a long time. Super Tennis is well done all the way through. Everything is just about perfect, with enough challenge to keep me coming back for more. Doubles games are especially fun. This game is more fun than the real thing. Samurai disagreed, giving it a 7. This is a pretty good tennis simulation for the Super Famicom. The sounds are truly amazing, the digitized voices are very cool, and sometimes even humorous. The gameplay is easy to pick up, and the 2-player tournaments are the highlight of this cart. I'm not into sports carts, but this one is actually pretty good. Now, believe it or not, every single review that we're going to talk about from here on out is above that 90% threshold. For example, Super Play gave Super Tennis a score of 92% in their very first issue. That's basically the same score we saw over at Ace, though their ridiculous 1,000 point scale makes the 920 look even more impressive. Mean Machines went one tick higher, giving it a 93%. And then there's Computer and Video Games, which went as high as a 96%, making it one of the highest scoring games of that year. Super Tennis is quite simply the most fun you'll have outside of the center court. And just make sure that there's nothing breakable around when you play. First of all, there's the quite breathtaking speed of the game. You have to be quick on the mark to return those rocket-hot serves and follow them up with an almost limitless variety of moves. Then there's the cutesy graphics and quite superb sound. So good that you'd actually swear that you're there. Above all, there's the unbelievable tension generated by the game. It's hard to explain, but you've just got to win. Super Tennis is a killer of a game, and any hotshot Famicom owner who doesn't bust his balls for a copy should get his head examined. It's that good. Now, if you've come here looking for the absolute highest mark that you can find for Super Tennis, then look no further than GamePro, who's no stranger to giving out perfect 5 out of 5 scores. They concluded that Super Tennis serves up some of the best gameplay, graphics, sound, and all-around action in a tennis, or for that matter, any sports card ever. The realism is uncanny, right down to the obnoxious ball boy who prowls the net between points. Super Tennis delivers. Of the 3 sports games that we covered this week, Super Tennis is by far the one that holds up the best. Sure, there are newer, better tennis games on the market, including ones from Nintendo, but I don't think you're going to be disappointed when you use the Nintendo Switch Online service to play Super Tennis.
Silencio, se juega Super Tenis. Elige tipo de pista y jugador. Juega solo o acompañado, contra la máquina o en un espectacular dobles. Selecciona bien tus golpes y calcula voleas y dejadas. Con Super Nintendo lo harás de campeonato.
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. I'm not gonna lie to you, I had a whole other episode worked out with F-Zero and Golden Sun, and it was ready to go. But then Nintendo just didn't announce them. Unfortunately, I'm going to be on the road this weekend, so if they do decide to release those previously confirmed titles, then I guess we'll cover them on Monday. Thankfully, I had this completely different episode written and ready to go just in case this happened. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite 16-bit sports game? It doesn't have to be one of these 3, obviously, but there are some really great sports games back in the day. Granted, most of those were on the Genesis, but I'm sure you won't hold back and you'll come up with something great in the comment section below. In other news, we'll be back next week with our first reviews of the new year, plus a new Nintendo Switch Online review. Who knows, maybe Nintendo will finally announce F-Zero and Golden Sun, just as they promised. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,